The dropping of sand, dolomite, clay started around the 28th. The first drops were, it seems, at the end of the day, on the 27th. All this has to be thoroughly described because it is necessary to precisely write about the physical implication of each action. For example, according to the government commission's view, there was an option to do nothing and let the graphite burn. However, this would result in the ejection of radioactive graphite particles across long distances. Under the conditions we set, the temperature of graphite combustion, the highest rate of combustion, is roughly a ton per hour. And given the total weight of 2,400 tons, the fire would have burned for 2,400 hours. At this rate, radioactivity would be emitted in the form of aerosols over long distances. This meant that first and foremost, the graphite fire had to be extinguished. This is why sand was used to extinguish the fire. Secondly, once there were sand, it meant that there was internal insulation, bringing additional trouble from possible heating of the area. Hence, elements like dolomite and lead were introduced. Lead is difficult to oxidize, dolomite decays. Endothermically, lead takes heat to melt. Dolomite also takes heat to melt. Silicon oxide, sand itself, also takes heat to melt. This is how a lot of the heat was absorbed by endothermic processes. And finally, elements such as clay, for example, served as filtering elements meant to prevent part of the radioactive isotopes from getting into the external environment. All this reasoning should be correlated with actual graphs, when and what was emitted, and when it stopped. In particular, it must be said that not all measures were prudent. For example, the injection of liquid nitrogen that was done per my proposal, made around the 2nd of May and implemented around the 4th of the 5th of May. This measure turned out to be pointless, because when I had proposed it, the extent of the destruction of the reactor was not yet known, and neither was known the natural air circulation, its natural flow. But after some time, we calculated that the airflow is so high that injecting and diluting it with liquid nitrogen would not have any effect. First of all, it leaked through the side gaps and practically passed by the reactor area that had the fuel. And secondly, its quantity was calculated entirely incorrectly. This is why we discontinued injecting liquid nitrogen. This measure did not prove to be useful in practice. About lead, it must be noted that our initial plan was, of course, to put metal, iron shot there. The shot was on station territory, but it was in a room that was heavily contaminated, making it impossible to load it into the helicopters. Also, we didn't know the exact temperatures at various points of the destroyed reactor. Say, for the uppermost points, we found that the temperature range was between 300 and 350 degrees Celsius. For this temperature range, lead would be the most suitable element, which would additionally act as a shield against radiation. For areas with higher temperatures that were located lower, we needed to deliver the metal, but then it would generate additional energy because of the overoxidation. This is why we chose silicon oxide, or sand, which would perform the same function, that is, melting, flowing in the same way as dolomite. Because magnesium oxide is a relatively good conductor of heat, the most conductive among all ceramics. This is why all these measures were quite sensible. Now, with the introduction of all these elements, such as lead, for example, we assessed if there would be lead contamination in the area. We calculated simply. 2,400 tons of lead were dropped. The assumption was that all this lead will get into the hot zone and evaporate, which is impossible because most of it condensed at the upper levels. Then we assumed that even if all the lead evaporates, we took the 30-kilometer zone and derived that all the contamination in this zone would turn out to be less than the permissible concentrations. At least later, Comrade Israel with his associates measured the lead concentration both in the air and on the ground. And it turned out that it was determined solely by the lead that comes from the automobile exhaust pipes from leaded gasoline. And against this background, against the background of lead contamination, to detect lead contamination caused by 2,400 tons scattered around was almost impossible. And there was a lot of talk about lead poisoning. That is why the calculations had to be very precise, accounting for all the measures that were taken. Then a few words need to be said about the concepts for the sarcophagus construction. There were 17 projects, but only 2 or 3 need to be described. The first concept, the embanked mound, and why we rejected that. Then the second option, a sarcophagus but with a concrete dome. Why we rejected that? Because the structure wouldn't withstand it. Why the concrete dome, which would certainly have been better, was replaced with a pipe run and a suitable metal roof. These circumstances need to be explained. It is necessary to explain the following facts in this order. This is very important. No country in the world, and quite a few countries, responded to our trouble, sent telegrams, proposals, etc. We became convinced that no country in the world had a proven, experimentally verified action plan for such a situation. This is the first circumstance. The second one, there were no dosimeters with proper scales for minimum to maximum doses. There were no unmanned aircraft that could be fitted with the necessary measuring equipment at the time of the accident, in the beginning to be precise. This forced us to use manned helicopters, which in turn caused additional radiation exposure for the people and made these flights dangerous because the helicopters could collide with some structure and lead to the destruction of, say, a neighboring block. Going back a bit, it has to be highlighted that the actions of the firemen were logical, because many journalists and in plays write that the firemen needlessly stayed there for several hours and got exposed to high radiation doses as a result. Their actions were rational, because there was hydrogen in the generators in the engine room. There was engine oil, and they expected that the fire could spread to the third block and cause damage there as well as in the fourth block. This is why their actions were truly selfless and most importantly rational, and not just some pointless actions arising out of ignorance. Further still, we must return to the fact that neither work nor reconnaissance robots were available in any country in the world. We bought and tried robots from other countries, but they failed either because they could not overcome the obstacles in the destroyed block, or because they could not be controlled when electronics failed due to the high gamma fields. And only recently, this must be also described, have our own reconnaissance robots been developed at the Institute of Nuclear Energy. It is necessary to talk about the management scheme for the process of liquidation, that is about the separation of functions. There was a group that investigated the causes of the accident, a group that was occupied with decontamination and preparation for the launch of the first and second block, a group that worked on analyzing what is being done in the fourth block, the wreckage, diagnostics, research, and other necessary things, a group that worked on the design for the sarcophagus itself, a group that worked on the construction of the sarcophagus, the army group that carried out the decontamination of the territory, a group that built new living spaces for the evacuated population, a group that worked on establishing decontamination posts to control transport and to wash and clean it. All this must be described in the most thorough and detailed manner. After that, as I see it, there should be a section named Current Status, where it should be stated that there is a coordination council in the Academy of Sciences that includes heads of departments responsible for the relevant type of work. Gozagroprom, Minatom Energo, as well as leading scientists experts from the fields of medicine, radiology, agriculture, and so on. And that this coordination council systematically analyzes the situation related to all the circumstances around this Chernobyl accident. Then have a section by Vladimir Fyodorovich Diomin, wherein simply described the following clearly: how many areas and people were affected, and to what degree, what has already been restored, and what hasn't. All that is related to consequences from the injured people to the damage to the Red Forest must be accurately and clearly described. The psychological factors arising out of the liquidation process must, under no circumstances, be forgotten, because a whole array of illnesses found in people, a whole array of phenomena related to the personnel who survived this tragedy, were not related to radiation sickness. This was unambiguously established by the doctors. But nevertheless, the psychological shock, and say, because of that psychological shock, cardiovascular dystonia was found in a large number of experts and continues to be found up until now. The shift mode of work, all that was experienced, all these circumstances must be naturally be described as the secondary factors. Here the doctors have a lot of information, and I think Vladimir Fyodorovich knows it well. If not, I can suggest all that is needed. In the next section, after the consequences of the accident have been described, the current research and agriculture measures that are being carried out right now must be outlined. What has already been discovered, what is encouraging for us, that is, the accumulation of radioactive elements inside fish and animals that are inside the 30-kilometer zone, what is not frightening, what is useful, what is useless, the behavior of the various tree species, all the Gozagroprom findings, only those that are currently very obvious, these should be described. And conclude this section about the consequences with such normal words, that this is a long-term program, that the consequences of this accident will manifest themselves for many, many years, and describe how they will manifest, and that the research front is broad, so to say, rough plan. It is possible to safely talk about the programs that are led by Ruteni Mikhailovich Polevoy, who established several of them. They can be regarded as the directions work should take. All this has to be done. Talk about the various organizations that are involved, both on the site and in their offices, about the medical radiology center that has been created there. All of this, in my opinion, has to be described in this section as obvious and clear. This section cannot be concluded with only the obvious and clear things. A whole variety of questions must be posed. For instance, we are not clear why there was no complete conformity in the decline of radioactivity in the fourth block. In some areas, it reduced faster than predicted by the laws of radioactive decay. There are various theories, but those are only theories. Therefore, we still cannot fully explain this phenomenon, but there are such theories. There are unsolved issues. For example, those remarkable photographs that are on my table, brought by Nikolai Nikolaevich Kuznetsov, where spruce has transitioned into pine form, that is, when spruce twigs start to branch in the same way as pines, and that we are starting to research the cause of this phenomenon, which, it needs to be said, is not clear to us. And all this should be collected into a group of unanswered questions, where we have the facts but no full explanations for those facts. This, as it seems to me, should be recorded because it would be foolish to say that everything is already fully apparent to us, fully clear. By the way, looking back, I want to say once again that the question of how positive reactivity was added is a matter of discussion, because there are various ways that could lead to the addition of positive reactivity in such an uncontrollable reactor. None of them unequivocally corresponds to all the experimental facts. That is why discussions are ongoing. But actually that doesn't have particular significance, because the main thing is that in principle it was possible to add positive reactivity with such a strong acceleration. This is the main thing, while the specific details are not so important, because the discussion itself shows that there were several ways to get the reactor to the state it was in. After the section by Vladimir Fyodorovich, I see that Vladimir Konstantinovich must be involved in two ways. The first way is to briefly, clearly, and plainly explain that, from the very beginning, the Soviet Union did not conceal anything. There are questions like, why was it announced so late? Well, because no one knew exactly what had happened. No one wanted to start to panic or give out wrong information. And what international measures have been taken, what conventions have been adopted, what was the Soviet Union's position on international cooperation? This part has to be stated as the completed part, and further to develop a philosophy that, as the experience of the Chernobyl accident shown, any device can cause trouble, not only in the country where it is located, but also in the neighboring countries, and cause not only radiation damage, but also economic and psychological losses in those countries. The questions of international inspections, quality checks of constructed facilities, to create this international procedure, it is necessary to express this desire, and this, in my opinion, would be right. Broadly, the international tasks section should be split into two parts. The first part should be about what the Soviet Union has done in the international arena, what material it has presented, whom it invited, who hosted, whose help it accepted, and whose help it refused. And the second part should be about how it will be necessary to inspect, control, and mutually verify the level of safety in nuclear energy in the international plan. I think that Vladimir Konstantinovich should develop these points. And finally, the last but, from my perspective, the most important section. It should begin with the measures that are planned in the Soviet Union to increase the safety of nuclear energy. Well, they are listed in the reports presented at Vienna. They must be included. Such and such things are planned. Such and such things have been implemented. And then, from the position of Vladimir Mikhailovich Novikov, state that the level of device that we currently have is probably sufficient to ensure that Chernobyl does not happen again. Although I must say that for those devices that do not have containments, these measures will probably not be enough. We need to think about some special measures to localize accidents for those 28 devices that do not have containments. It is clear that these localization measures must be dynamic, because it is economically and technically impossible to build containments over them. And these non-traditional dynamic localization methods for possible accidents at such facilities need to be thought about by us today, well, mainly by the Soviet community, because it is our problem, although we would happily cooperate internationally for this task. This is the problem. So this is what it is. Today our measures are planned. Such and such have been implemented, and such issues worry us. Next comes the philosophy. Can the Soviet Union, for example, limit the number of devices that are there, gradually put those that have no containment out of service, and hence switch to fossil fuel? Kuzmin and my work can be used here that considers this particular question, whether it is possible to do without nuclear sources in our country, which is so rich in fossil fuel, and shows that it is impossible. That we will need nuclear sources in an ever-increasing amount, firstly, due to economic considerations, resources, and secondly, environmental. And most importantly, emphasize that nuclear sources, as any previous sources, are not only the bearer of energy, but also the bearer of new technology. It can be taken from my older works that we mostly use heat, radiation today. But actually, it is possible to produce synthetic materials to alloy, modify, or remove impurities in nuclear sources more simply and more economically than is done today. In, for example, chemical or metallurgical industry, this is one more proof that we cannot do without them. And thereafter would be the concept developed by Vladimir Mikhailovich about what safe nuclear energy should look like. I will not talk about safe reactors because the requirements formulated by Novikov are very accurate, but a full cycle of nuclear fuel safety must be added to those requirements, and quantitative estimates must be made for the processing and enrichment plants similar to those that were made for the reactor. Considering the latest accident in Brazil, it is even worthwhile to mention the use of radiopharmaceuticals and the forms of their use. It seems impossible to stop using them, but how can their use be made safe? The question should be thought through in such a way that the understanding of safe nuclear energy is as wide as possible and not limited only to the question of creating a safe reactor. And I would very much like to ask to make such a statement that, as of today, we do not have safe nuclear energy, or a concept of safe nuclear energy, or even a concept of a safe nuclear reactor that is completely ready. And since the number of such nuclear devices must increase, the problem becomes urgent. The time available to solve it is not too small, but not too much either. It is about 15-20 years, within which all the questions we are discussing here must be resolved. This, roughly, is a structure according to which all the material should be prepared. And I repeat that it should be based on the work we have previously done, so that we refer to our own sources and not someone else's.